Hello, I'm Robert Royal. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Catholic Thing, and this is a Catholic Thing podcast, which we're now putting on the air under the heading of the Vatican Thing, because we are in the midst, we're actually at the end of the second week of the Synod on Synodality in Rome. And we're joined today by a longtime friend, Father Robert Sirico, who may be known to some of you. Father Sirico was the president of the Acton Institute in Michigan for many years, made it into a very successful institute, or an academic think tank that defended free markets, a free and virtuous society, and had an enormous influence throughout the world and continues to have an influence throughout the world, even though he's recently become emeritus. So, Father Sirico, we're both in Rome, although we're in different locations this morning. It's great to be with you again in Rome. One of the things, the consolations of getting older is you actually had friends over a long time who you know are absolutely reliable and will be with us no matter what battles we end up finding ourselves in.
True.
So it's great to be with you.
Thank you. Good to be with you too.
One of the reasons we're getting together this morning, in addition to some talk about the Synod, is a new book that Father helped assemble, a series of essays about the late and great Cardinal George Pell from Australia. It's called Pell Contra Mundum. I hope you can see it there. It's out recently. It's in 4 languages, and it has several essays about Cardinal Pell and several essays by Cardinal Pell. So he was an enormously important influence in the church, a very powerful man, a very big man in many respects. And for those of us who knew him, he was sometimes a tough friend to have because he spoke the truth to us in charity, but he spoke the truth to us. So, Father, you knew him well. Why don't you just give us a kind of brief thumbnail sketch of what his life was like and your own relationship with him?
Well, I knew the Cardinal, I estimate about 25 years. And the last time I saw him was the evening of the funeral of Pope Benedict. We had dinner in his apartment just outside the Vatican. In fact, it's the same apartment building that Pope Benedict himself lived in when he was Ratzinger. And we had been speaking for some time about the concerns that he expressed in various essays and conversations about the direction of the Synod and the lack of clarity, particularly doctrinal and moral clarity. And of course, none of us expected to have happened 5 days later what happened, and that was his death here in Rome. His friends were really downcast about that because we looked at him as kind of the leader of what we do, how we would approach this synod. And once the grieving isn't done, but after we got through that period of mourning, the idea came to me to make Pell's voice present at the synod in the same way that Newman was the absent father at the Second Vatican Council. And that was the essay that we published here, was the essay in the London Spectator that was published on the day of his death. It had been held there, and in fact, we had talked about it. He was waiting for it to come out. And finally, it was published. And so that's one of the essays in the book, along with
I think we ought to tell our viewers that I think the main point that he makes there is that the divine dream of synodality had turned into what he called a toxic nightmare.
Yes.
That's kind of a hallmark of the way he spoke, very directly and without pulling any punches. For those of you who don't know, Cardinal Pell was an Aussie rules footballer and could have actually played professional football back in his native Australia, but chose to become a priest. And then he also said a very interesting thing. I think that it was one of the most unclear or imprecise documents ever to come out of Rome. Will you comment a bit about what you think he meant by that?
Well, I think what he meant by it is what we're seeing at the Synod right now. I mean, there is, when you try to get clarity, that is resisted at every level. in all the press conferences we've heard. We just walk together and we'll see what's going to happen, that kind of thing. And I think that's exactly what he was saying. This was almost like a wheel in the middle of a wheel. You just didn't know what was meant by things, and inconsistent in various ways. And now that it's really being played out in full time, I think the Cardinal's insights were prescient.
Yeah, you start to compare him with the great Saint John Henry Newman, and I think your essay in the book is drawn on that speech that I was present for that you gave at that tribute to Cardinal Pell a couple months ago here in Rome. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but there are many ways in which those of us who know Newman and Pell would think of them as different, but there are also, you say, similarities. Could you tell us a little bit about both the differences and the similarities that you see there?
Well, the differences are very apparent. I mean, Newman was the Oxford gentleman, very delicate in his speech and never wanted to wound anyone. But the similarities are astounding too. So Pell, as you say, was an Aussie rules football player, and very blunt and direct, as you've given an example. But the similarity of them, interestingly enough, they both went to Propaganda Fide, the missions seminary. They both went to Oxford. They both were willing to engage the controversial issues of their day. They both had very defining legal cases. In Pell's case, he was vindicated by the highest court in Australia. And they both had a sense of the centrality of the deposit of faith. For both of these men, the divine revelation needed to be preserved intact, that the role of the bishop, the role of the church, the role of the pope is to hand on faithfully. And I think that they did this in very different ways. I mean, Newman wrote his way into the church by writing the essay on the development of Christian doctrine, which, to my mind, is the answer to the ambiguity of the question of the day: can the church update itself? And Newman's answer was, of course, the church can update. It always is updating itself, but it has to do that with certain guideposts to prevent it from being an inauthentic development, that is a non-development, an actual change. And that's the arguments that Pell was bringing at the end of his life. It preoccupied him in his last days.
Yeah, we're hearing the word development used a lot these days in the Synod in a way that I think would have turned Cardinal Newman's hair white, because there are 7 notes, as you and I both know, that Newman puts forward of how we know the difference between a corruption and a development. A corruption is something that changes the teaching. A development is actually a growth of the teaching rather than a change in the fundamentals, the principles behind the teaching.
What Newman called it was going from the implicit to the explicit. Right. It's not like the Holy Spirit said one thing in the first century and is saying the opposite in the 21st century. And that's the argument right now, which is, by the way, not being engaged.
Yeah. No, it's astonishing that at a time when the question of truth, I think, is so critical to the future of the life of the church, when other facets of the tradition, such as fidelity to the gospel, to even the Jewish tradition that stands behind the Christian tradition, all of that, it seems to me, is being eclipsed by these buzzwords like LGBT community, which isn't really a community at all. There are lots of tensions within that acronym LGBT.
Sure.
And the sort of typical worldly concerns at a time when we're trying to get away from being worldly and actually reaffirm the saving message of Jesus Christ in the world. It's a diversion, I think, from what are the really burning issues in the church.
Let's just take that LGBTQ plus thing and look at it from the point of view of what could be an authentic development and what would be a corruption. Mm-hmm. An authentic development, I think of that, would be speaking with great charity. In fact, one of the people who really has done that in the modern era was Father John Harvey, through the founding of Courage and the way he spoke about the dignity persons with homosexual orientation. And the tone of the church and the willingness to incorporate people struggling with chastity in very much the same way that Jesus protects the woman caught in the act of adultery from the brutality of the people who wanted to stone her. And the whole of that, almost the whole of that encounter with the woman is Jesus protecting her. The last thing he says to her is, "Go and sin no more." Now, a corruption of that compassion is to say, come as you are and stay as you are. That there's no challenge to anything. There's no challenge of chastity that's called forth. And the truth of the matter is, we could have a real development in this area if we were working together on it, rather than trying to change the church's teaching to accommodate ourselves to something that is essentially alien to the moral teaching of the church.
Yes, and as we know, the kind of militancy of the so-called LGBT community is something that I think once the impression is given that the Holy Father has sort of given a green light to blessings and then who knows what. I mean, we don't know where I think we do know where that's going to end, because there won't be any satisfaction in that so-called dialogue until there's an affirmation and an acceptance of actual homosexual practice, I believe. Yeah. Listen, one last point, because we want to keep these conversations short, and we could have you back. We're both going to be here till the end of the synod this month of October. One of the points that I kind of was reminded of reading some of the essays in your book is how important it was that Cardinal Pell, at least initially, was involved in trying to reform the finances of the church. There's just a story out today in Rome that one of the Vatican financial officials is saying that there's a shortfall of 45 or 50 million euros again this year in the church, and that cutting back on activity inside the church, even firing people, is not going to be able to remedy that shortfall.
No.
Pell was very much engaged in trying to reform the corruption and put the church on a firmer financial basis. Could you just, because Acton Institute has been involved in business and that sort of thing, could you comment just a little bit about that?
Well, he really did bring what's called an Anglo-Saxon mentality to this. Let's examine it. Let's get all the documents. And in fact, one of the chapters in this book is written by a man who was very close to him when Pell was the head of the, what do they call it, the economic dicastery. And that would be Danny Casey. And he kind of gives you the whole panorama of what Pell was involved in. And if you think this is just history, as we are going through this synod, there's a trial going on the other end of the Vatican about the Beshu and these other people, Cardinal Beshu, who are being charged with corruption and examining. Pell and Casey had called for, and I think they actually began an audit of the Vatican finances. And then
they hired PricewaterhouseCoopers to do an audit.
Exactly. And then it was abruptly stopped. It had received the Pope's permission, and then the Secretary of State, with the permission of the Holy Father, stopped it. And at that time, that's when the accusations came in Australia against Pell that continues this whole drama. He has to then go back to Australia, which he didn't have to do legally because he had a Vatican passport. He could have stayed in Rome. He went back and faced the charges. Two courts disagreed, and then he was jailed for 400 some days, and then finally vindicated by the High Court in Australia. Cardinal Gracias, who wrote the introduction to this book, Pell Contra Mundum, refers to Cardinal Pell as a white martyr. And if you read the details of what happened in that case, you see that he was the victim of really a media hysteria.
Persecution and hysteria.
No, very much so. And it's documented. You can read the whole story of it. But the gentleness with which he came out, the intriguing question to me that we don't have the answer to is, was there some connection between the investigations that he was beginning in Rome and the accusations in Australia that rose at that time. We don't have, as Cardinal Pell told me when I asked him directly, he said, we don't yet have a smoking gun, but time will
Right.
tell.
Hamilton. Well, since we're talking about books and we have to wrap up, I think we should also tell our viewers that there are 3 volumes of Cardinal Pell's Prison Notebook. Really interesting reading. They're not a spiritual guide, but they're also at the same time they still are kind of a testimony to what a stable, solid human being he was, even in circumstances that would probably drive most of us absolutely crazy. So we want to recommend
Well
that.
worth the read.
Yeah, let me again recommend Pell Contra Mundum for those who are interested. Father, thank you very much for being with us
Great being with you.
this
Ci
morning.
vediamo presto, Bob.
Ci rivediamo presto. Okay, everyone, it's good to have you here. We're coming up on a weekend for the Synod here in Rome, but we'll see you back sometime next week.